Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I have an interesting collection review from my good viewer Nick, and this collection is quite an interesting one because it has a really great number of different types of timepieces, from the luxury down to the entry level, making it a very interesting collection. It equally covers every base really of the type of watch there is, from sports to dress. It also combines mechanical watches with quartz ones too. So there really is something for everybody. Now I apologise if you can hear some background disturbance and noise. I'm afraid it's raining very, very hard here where I live, and it's very difficult to hide the noise of the rain in the background, so I hope that shan't be too much of a problem. Now starting from the top left-hand side, we start off with this Jaeger-LeCoultre Reverso ultra-thin tribute to 1931. Now this is a very thin, as the name would imply, variant of the Reverso, which was of course a polo player's watch, so it could be turned over and reversed to protect the dial and the face while playing polo. But this version has a very different dial to the one which one is usually used to seeing, which is the sort of the Art Deco numeral version. This version has the simple sort of baton style hour markers. And again, the second track goes around the very edge of the dial, as opposed to the central section, as seen on most Reversos. Now, I think this is a very nice piece, especially on that crocodile skin strap which it's on, because it really does combine a very different aesthetic to the standard watch, with that black giving off a very modern look, which is something that one can't say about most Reversos, which really do hark back to the original Art Deco era, whereas I feel this watch actually sits in a very timeless sort of bracket, if you will, in terms of watch design, simply because of the simplicity and sheer elegance of the dial. The movement inside this watch is also very traditional, in that it's a manually wound 3 Hz movement, as opposed to the more complicated automatic versions seen in the thicker and altogether larger Grand Date, for example. So I think this has a very old-fashioned and very simple sort of vibe to this watch, if you will, which I think is quite refreshing when we live in a world with very complicated timepieces that people wear, with a great number of complications. This is very simple and refreshing. Next, we have a watch which is very close to my heart in design, and this is the Breitling Type 20 Aéronaval 3800 ST. Now, despite having such a long name, this is a surprisingly classic and simple watch, with a fully polished bezel and polished lugs. But it harks back to the days when pilots used to wear these fairly simple and legible chronographs, which were of course made by Breitling, which we usually know of as being a very sort of elitist and I suppose elitist isn't really the right word, but very classic, very traditional sort of brand, which doesn't go into the sports watch bracket. This watch really does defy that trend. Now, the sizing of this watch is also a pleasure because it's 39mm, which is substantially less than most chronographs we see these days, which are around the 42 to 44mm size, which for a watch which combines rotating bezel and a flyback chronograph, which is of course the key complication of this watch, having a slightly smaller watch is a pleasure, really. Now, the reason why this watch has the flyback chronograph is that because pilots had to be able to restart the chronograph very quickly, pressing the top pusher to stop it, then the bottom pusher to reset it, and then the top pusher again to restart the chronograph, was a hassle, and in gloves would take a while. A good few seconds, whereas with a flyback you can simply press one pusher and it's restarted, which is a really major advantage. Equally, these watches were loomed quite heavily on most of their hands, and on most versions of this watch, meaning that you could quickly tell the time at a glance, even in the dark. Next, we have a Speedmaster Professional 42mm from 2016. Now, this watch is the standard professional size, so the 42mm, so it hasn't grown to the size of the coaxial, which is 44. And I think the 42 is still the classic size for the Speedmaster. And this watch is slightly different because rather than having the Hesselite crystal, which the older versions have, this has a sapphire crystal. Equally, this doesn't have a solid caseback. This has a sapphire see-through caseback, so you can look at the movement. And as pointed out by Nick, purists would tend to steer clear of this version and go for a closed caseback and Hesselite version. But actually, I think if one's going to really enjoy the watch, it's nice to be able to see the movement ticking away, and to see the craftsmanship that one's paid for. Now, of course, this is the benchmark, really, for all chronographs. It has that manually wound movement, which really is a marvel. It's been around for a long time, and of course, this watch saw NASA to the moon and so on. And equally, the design of this watch is timeless. It may not be as classic as the Breguet, for example, but it does have a certain charm which one doesn't find elsewhere, and does make this watch a really wonderful thing to own. Now next we have a Breitling Superocean Heritage, and this is a watch which again is a favourite. It is a fully polished 200-metre diver with a very particular aesthetic, which is very different to, for example, a vintage Rolex or Omega, and is very, very particular to Breitling with those particular hands. Now, I'd say this watch is more of a leisure diver on the basis that it doesn't have the specifications that really would see it as being a professional dive watch. For example, the bezel isn't loomed at any point, and the second hand doesn't have any loom, and equally the loom on the dial is extremely minimal. But nonetheless, a wonderful watch, and I've praised this watch endlessly, actually, on the channel. And equally, on that rubber strap, it is a lovely watch. I think the polished bracelet, that Milanese bracelet, does look wonderful, but there's no denying that the rubber strap is more practical for daily wear, and is likely more comfortable with those perforations to allow the wrist to breathe. Now, the movement in this watch is an ETA 2824 at base, but it has been modified and adjusted very heavily by Breitling, which does make it a very good and reliable movement for this particular watch. Now, next we have a 2007 wave dial Seamaster. Now, this is the Seamaster 300, and actually is one of the very last times they made the black dial version with those sword style hands. After that, they've only become the sort of Bond style of this watch, and I think that's a shame because this watch always reminded me of those vintage 60s Seamaster 300s, which one sees that are worth so much these days. And I must say, it's nice to see one of these because they combine the reliability of a modern Seamaster with those vintage aesthetics of the older version. Now, this watch is Quartz. So it's an ETA-based quartz that's been reused by Omega. Has been modified slightly, but has primarily remained an ETA quartz. And some people would say that that's it's a bad thing to buy a quartz from Omega. But actually, considering the price that one can get these watches for, with the quartz movement, I think it's actually a steal really to buy this this watch in the quartz version, seeing as one can get them for. I mean, Nick here said he got his for around £800, whereas I've seen these days for about £600, which is really incredible for a Seamaster. Next, we have an IWC Pilot's Watch Mark 17, which is an interesting watch because it sits below the big Pilot, while offering a slightly more conservative size of 41mm. Although the new version has dropped down to 40 again, but this version on the screen now is the 41. And interestingly, this watch actually has become more minimalistic since the production of this particular watch here, and I personally prefer the one that Nick has here to the new one, because Nick's one has this little red indicator by the date, and one can't quite see it with the hands in the way there, but it points to the central date with that 3-date open date wheel, which is something that I think is an interesting touch and really does bring out the dial with that little splash of red. Now, IWC are known for pilot's watches before anything else, and they really do their pilot's watches very, very well. They make these beautiful loomed watches with fairly simple designs, but that really do work, and they've clearly put a lot of attention and care into producing. Now, the movement inside this watch is in fact an ETA 2892 that's been modified by IWC, which I don't think is by any means a problem or anything bad, so considering the 2892 actually sits above the 2824 in terms of quality and design, and equally in terms of durability. Now, whereas the 2824 is always a good movement, the 2892 does show a certain finesse. Now, it's not an in-house movement, that is true, but it's still a nice and easily serviced movement that will never cause any problems, and is generally an accepted and well-made movement. Now, this next watch is the Tudor Heritage Monte Carlo, and it's a 42mm chronograph, which is based on a watch from the 1970s, which was a 36mm timepiece. And it was sort of a lesser model to the Rolex Daytona. But I think in many ways I'd rather own one of these watches, because they have a certain flair and excitement about them that the Daytona never did have. Equally, I think this new watch in the 42mm guise is a fantastic holiday watch. It's the sort of watch you'd want to take to a trip to the Mediterranean, for example, because it combines that oyster case, so you can go swimming with it, that 100-metre oyster case, with a GMT bezel and a chronograph. So really, what more could you want? It equally has the date at 6 as well, so it makes an extremely complete package, and with really everything you might ever need. Now, of course, this watch does come in two colours, a blue and a black. Now, my personal choice will be the blue, simply because it has a certain bright flair and fun aspect to it, which the black I don't feel does have. But then again, the black is more wearable on a day-to-day basis, so I can understand buying the black version as opposed to the very bright azure sort of blue. Now, interestingly enough, this watch doesn't actually have a Valerie 7750, which is the movement which you'd expect from Tudor, but instead it has an ETA 2892 with a chronograph module placed on top, which is an interesting move, but it does mean that you can get a much more serviceable movement to the 7750 at a slightly more accessible price. So I can understand why they've done it, and equally it gives them that particular arrangement of having the subdials on the left, the right, and the right, and then the date at 6 o'clock, which is something that you couldn't do with a 7750. Now, this next watch is the Christopher Ward C70 Brooklands Kosk limited edition 42mm quartz wristwatch, and it's a chronograph, and you can tell that it's an ETA quartz due to the arrangement of the subdials and the date. But equally, this is a very fun watch, inspired by the Brooklands racetrack in the UK, and it's a fun watch with a quartz movement, so it's very durable. And again, that quartz has been Kosk certified, which is something that you can't get really from a mechanical watch at this price point. So it makes for a very fun sort of sports watch with a chronograph, which again comes on that excellent Christopher Ward bracelet with their particular clasp. Next we have an interesting watch, and this is the Speedmaster Date 1957, which is a limited edition and has the caliber 3304 automatic movement. And this sort of sits between the normal Speedmaster professional and the more high-end coaxial, because it still has that classic layout with the three subdials, but it's also automatic. But it doesn't have the same features and the same coaxial escapement as the higher-end coaxial, but still has that automatic practicality, which is something that one of course doesn't have with the standard professional, which has to be wound. This watch also has that cream and grey dial, which wouldn't be my first choice, but definitely gives a very different aesthetic, and one which one doesn't usually see with that high legibility, very no-nonsense professional dial, with the contrasting hands and black dial. But this one gives more of a relaxed leisure sort of timepiece, which will be more appealing to some, and does give a more old-fashioned look. Now, we also have the Seiko 55 Fathoms, which is based on the Seiko 5, SNZH 57, or whichever other version which you happen to go for, depending on the particular variant. But again, it has an in-house Seiko movement, and I have reviewed this watch on the channel. And it's a modified version which resembles the older Blancpain 50 Fathoms, which is of course a beautiful watch, but a very expensive one. And this watch does give the nice satisfaction of having a watch which resembles it closely. This watch does actually have an in-house movement from Seiko, which is something which you can't say about very many watches in this price point, in terms of having an in-house movement. It also has a nice acrylic bezel, which looks very old-fashioned, but while looking still crisp and very attractive. Now, the dial on this watch has a slightly different look to my version, because I have the version with the indices rather than the numerals, which is the more classic version, whereas this one, which Nick has, doesn't have the gold accents, so it looks more contemporary, while also having the numerals, which is something which the more modern 50 Fathoms go for. Next, we have a pair of Rado watches, which are quite interesting in their minimalistic design, with their blackened cases and gold accents. And these watches are quite interesting in that they have a design which is very different to other watches. Very few brands make integrated bracelets which really do integrate with the case. So these are interesting. Personally, not my taste, because to me they're simply too. I suppose they're not ornate, but they wouldn't suit me as a person. But they're definitely very different watches and attractive in their own way. However, one watch which I absolutely adore is this Seiko Cocktail, which has this very minimalistic aesthetic, and I believe these are actually Japanese internal domestic models. So you have to be quite clever in getting them elsewhere. One has to buy them from different sources, but they're very attractive watches with those patterned dials with the sort of concentric lines. If anything, this watch reminds me very much of my Longines Conquest heritage, because of those that sunburst effect on the dial. Equally, this is known as the Cocktail because it has that very dressy appeal. Again, it has sword style hands, but they're baton sort of swords, so they taper into a point rather than opening up and then narrowing. And again, that blue second hand is a beautiful touch. Equally, we have this Lindex 1950s wristwatch, which is the one you see on the far left, and a better picture of it is here. And it was made in Germany with a Beforder caliber 113 movement, and it's very minimalistic in its design, but with that black that black style of dial, with the gold indices really do bring out a certain colour in the dial. I think the most beautiful thing about this watch is definitely that white edge around the black dial, which is a beautiful touch and something I haven't seen elsewhere. Even that cyclops on the dial, which is a concave one as opposed to the usual convex. These are all features which look absolutely beautiful, and I think this was a really beautiful find, and a watch which I envy endlessly. Now, Nick also has this Quartz Pulsar, which is again a squared design with a black and gold sort of aesthetic, but with that white brush style in the middle. This watch also has very minimalistic baton-style hands without a second hand, which is a nice touch because often dress watches look better without having the extra complication of having a second hand on the dial. Now, though not my taste, this watch's aesthetic goes very, very well with the Rados in this collection, which is something which again fits with the collection. I think it shows a certain route the collection is going down, a certain general design, if you will. Now, in his collection, Nick also has this beautiful Junghans, which has a very individual aesthetic and design, which I personally find very attractive. So as you can see that they're the case is sort of radially brushed, going out towards the edges with a polished bezel. Again, that brushed blue sunburst dial is really beautiful and complements that cream second track around the edge of the dial very nicely. Again, equally the hands having that white line down the middle of them, which I believe is loomed, along with that minimalistic loom around the edges of the dial, gives the whole watch an aesthetic which is particular to the 70s, of course the era that this watch is from. It is a Swiss, it's a German-made watch, but with a Swiss movement, a Swiss quartz movement. Now, I'm not a quartz fan, as you know, but I think a good Swiss quartz is better really than a low quality automatic. So actually, I think if you have a good quality quartz, that really is something to be appreciated. I will also point out what a good choice the straplets on this watch is, because due to that leather grain, and equally the colouring of the leather being blue, it means that it alternates between colours, which matches the dial, and it's changing between colours depending on the light very, very well, making a very complete and very, just a very attractive combination of these colours, being separated again by that cream and that silver of the case. Now, the final Speedmaster in the collection, of the three, is this Speedmaster First Generation Reduced. Now, this is a beautiful 38mm watch that was meant to be the sort of the entry class, I suppose, of Speedmasters. Now, I think it's become quite a legend, really, in the small watch community, simply due to its interesting proportions, sharing similar case designs and cues with the full-on professional. However, it has an automatic movement and a slightly different crown placement. But overall, this is a beautiful little 38mm watch with an automatic ETA 2892 with a chronograph module on the top. Now, that does give this watch an interesting quirk, which is that its crown sits lower than its pushers. Some people may find this unattractive, but I personally like it because it means you never press the wrong bump on the side of the watch. Inadvertently, you know in the dark, for example, which is the top pusher and which is the crown. Now, this is a first-generation version of this watch because it has the minute numerals around the dial, rather than the 2 dots at 12 o'clock, as the professional has. And I think this watch does sort of differentiate itself a little bit with those. It also has a Hesselite crystal. But in the second generation of this watch, which this watch is the first generation, they removed those numerals around the edges of the dial, instead replaced them with those 2 loom dots at 12 o'clock. And they also, in that version, made the crystal sapphire, and the water resistance increased to 100 meters from 50. But I think this one carries the real essence of the Reduced, and what a wonderful little watch this thing is. Next, we have this incredibly complete Seiko automatic chronograph, and this is a watch which I think is very interesting due to its features as a timepiece from the 70s, so a vintage timepiece, because it has a very individual aesthetic. So it does have a tachymeter underneath the crystal, so it doesn't stick out like the Speedmaster's does, for example, or a Daytona's. But again, it has this bicompax layout of chronograph, except they're mounted vertically. And you also have the day-date complication, which is something you don't usually see. Now, of course, this has an in-house Seiko chronograph movement, which isn't a quartz movement, it's an automatic one, which is something which, again, is wonderful to see. Now, quirks of this watch are the fact that, for example, if you look at the bottom of the dial, the 30-minute chronograph counter actually includes a 60, 40, and 50-minute. It's 60, 50, and 40-minute numerals around it, showing you that you can actually time for about an hour, even though it doesn't actually show the hours on it. Which again is something nice to see, so you can count through the full hour rather than just the first 30 minutes of the hour, more precisely. Again, equally, that day-date complication is very practical to have, and again, those gold tones of the dial lend for a very a dated but very attractive look, and one which one doesn't see on modern watches. These are aesthetics which usually are seen only on the vintage timepieces. The case of this watch is also quite interesting, because it has those hooded lugs, even though they actually are quite sharp on the corners. They're still hooded, which again is something which you don't see, because usually cases with hooded lugs are very much rounded, whereas this is an exception to the rule, which is of course something nice to see. Now finally we have 2 beautiful little Omegas, the first of which is this Geneve from 1969. with a gold case. And I'm not sure if this one is plated, filled, or solid, but it definitely has that attractive aesthetic of a vintage dress watch. It also has the old style of Omega logo, which is something nice with the sort of more ornate shape to the Omega symbol. It also has Geneve at the bottom of the dial, and that's that cream sunburst dial, which is just timeless and something which again reminds me of my Longines Conquest heritage, which is again such a beautiful look. It has very simple baton-style hands and a timeless look. Again, these are mechanical watches due to the period of time they were made, and really Geneves offer fantastic value for money these days, and really offer brilliant dress watch capabilities. These also have very attractive sloping dials at the corners and the edges, giving the whole watch a more rounded look, as opposed to modern dress watches, which often have flat dials, which lend for a more modern aesthetic, but not as rounded and sort of soft a look as these watches. Last, but most definitely not least of all, we have this beautiful automatic Omega from 1977, and it really is an incredible condition for the era. The dial shows very, very little change, and it's a gold dial with that white date disc, as you can see, in those black indices and hands, which give a great contrast to this watch and match that black leather strap this watch is on very, very well. It has an 18-karat gold case, which is again a lovely feature, so that's solid 18-karat, and then again a gold Omega symbol and black writing. This is again a very, very simple style of watch, similar to that Geneve I last showed you, but again with those straight lugs and that very simple dial, which again, this is a timeless beauty, and this one's automatic as well, as opposed to a manually wound one, giving it just that extra level of practicality for daily wear. Now, on that black strap, I think it works very, very well. Usually, I think brown straps play down gold, while black straps play up gold. And this one definitely does. It makes the whole watch very lustrous, I think, and brings out those black hands and indices. Anyway, I shall end here, and I thank you all very much for watching. I thank Nick for sending me in his collection. So thank you all very much for watching. Do please like, share and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more on this channel. Any subscription or like is always appreciated for the channel. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.